All right, reading Johnny Tremain by Esther Forbes, and it's illustrated by Lynd Ward and published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. We are in the middle. So we just finished chapter 6, and that was the last section. Section 6 was all about the tea party itself and Johnny's role in the whistle blowing so that he can alert all of the boys that Rab had rallied and all the Patriots had rallied, the teams of people who were going to break those tea chests open and dump them into the harbor. And so all that was done. And then, of course, Johnny happens to see someone stuffing tea into his pants, and it turns out it's none other than Dove, who hasn't really changed so much as he's looking for the easy way out and stealing tea, but they are kind of joking. Johnny says, "He swim good," he grunted at Rab, for everyone was talking Indian that night. Rab picked up the fat Dove as though he were a rag baby and flung him into the harbor. So that's his punishment. Then he has to go swim ashore. So it's the teamwork of the Sons of Liberty and the rebels. And then they say the admiral is kind of watching. So everybody knows this is going to happen. People have been talking about it for weeks. And the admiral, even the British admiral, had been watching, and he says, "You've got to pay the fiddler yet. Like, sure, you're a bunch of rebels, and sure, you've had a fine, pleasant evening for your Indian caper, haven't you? But they are going to have some sort of punishment. This will not go unpunished." And there we are at chapter 7 in Roman numerals. V is 5, and then the 1 and 1 would be 5 plus 2, and that means 7. So not a lot of people know how to read the Roman numerals. And this one is called the Fiddler's Bill. Okay, the bill is going to come due. And here is our illustration, and it looks like there's going to be some military intervention. True. So let's get started. But when that bill came, the Fiddler's Bill, that bill for the tea, it was so much heavier than anyone expected. Boston was thrown into a paroxysm of anger and despair. There had been many a moderate man who had thought the Tea Party a bit lawless and was now ready to vote payment for the tea. So it's like they're making them hurt with these sanctions. But when these men heard how cruelly the town was to be punished, they swore it would never be paid for. And those other 13 colonies, up to this time, many of them had had little interest in Boston's struggles. Now they were united as never before. The punishment united the often jealous, often indifferent, separate colonies, as the Tea Party itself had not. And I want you to think right here of that join or die cartoon, the political cartoon that Benjamin Franklin had created with the snake, and it was chopped up into pieces, basically saying, England is going to pick us apart, colony by colony, if we don't unite as an entire snake and fight back. Sam Adams was so happy his hands shook worse than ever, for it had been voted in far-off London that the port of Boston should be closed. Not one ship might enter, not one ship might leave the port, except only His Majesty's warships and transports until the tea was paid for. Boston was to be starved into submission. On that day, that 1st of June, 1774, Johnny and Rab, like almost all the other citizens, did no work, but wandered from place to place all over town. People were standing in angry knots, talking, gesticulating, swearing that yes, they would starve, they would go down to ruin rather than give in now. Even many of the Tories were talking like that, for the punishment fell equally heavily upon the king's most loyal subjects in Boston, and on the very Indians who had tossed the tea overboard. This closing of the port of Boston was indeed tyranny. This was oppression. This was the last straw upon the back of many a moderate man. Okay, so this is the moderates, the people in the middle are turning towards the Sons of Liberty, and they're turning towards the patriot side because they're saying this is totally unfair for everyone to be punished for the deeds of a few. The boys strolled the waterfront. Here on Long Wharf, merchants' counting houses were closed and shuttered, sail lofts deserted. The riggers and porters stood idle. Overnight, hundreds of such, and sailors and rope makers, wharf fingers and dock hands, had been thrown out of work. The great ships of Boston, which had been bringing wealth for over 100 years, were idle at their berths. That means where they dock. Not one might come and go. This reminds me so much of the beginning of quarantine, when everything was closed, everything was shuttered, everybody had to stay home, there was nothing to do, no one is working. And even now, it's been almost a year later, many businesses have gone out of business due to these forced closures. At first, it was the men of the ships and wharves that were thrown out of work and could not get food for their families. The paralysis that started there would soon spread out and include everybody. For who could now buy the new clothes or buy new clothes? The clothiers and tailors would close shop. Not one man in Boston could afford a silver basin. The silversmiths would not last long. Nobody could pay rent. The wealthy landowners were headed for bankruptcy. "So," said Rab cheerfully, "looks like we'd all starve together." They stood at the very end of Long Wharf, which ran a half-mile out into the harbor. They could see the Captain, British flagship, stationed between Long and Hancock's Wharf and over by Governor's Island, the Lively, and beyond, the Mercury, the Magdalen, the Tartar. His Majesty's fleet surrounded Boston, enforcing the Port Act. Uncle Lorne is upset. He says the printers will not be able to go on with the newspapers. He won't be able to collect subscriptions or get any advertising. He won't be able to buy paper nor ink. He's sending the Webb twins home? Yes, back to Chelmsford. But he and I can manage. The Observer is to be half size. He won't give up. He'll keep on printing and printing about our wrongs and our rights until he drops dead at his press or gets hanged. There had been a good deal of talk about hanging. Governor Hutchinson was ordered to England. General Gage from now on would be in charge. Now remember in the textbook, in our social studies book, when they talked about Governor Hutchinson being too soft on the rebels, not putting down the insurrections, okay? So General Gage is going to have the laws of blood, if you recall them. Regiment upon regiment of the finest British troops were arriving. They were planning to put down sedition, all right. They were planning to put down sedition, all right. And everyone knew that Gage had the right to send any man whom he believed a leader in this revolt against England to London. And the parody of a trial, that means it's going to be laughable because they'll be found guilty, certain death on the gallows. Or, if he wished, Gage might erect his gallows over here. Sam Adams and Hancock, Dr. Warren, perhaps still James Otis, would be the first to go. Certainly all the other members of the Observers, if ever their names were known, would follow, and so would all the Whig printers of Boston. No wonder Uncle Lorne was a little nervous. By nature, he was a timid man, yet, timid or bold, he would go on printing, begging the people of Massachusetts to wake up and resist this tyranny before it was too late. He would print until he had not a sheet of paper left to print on, or until the very day the gallows was set up for him. As yet, only the British men of war had arrived, but the transports were on the seas. Soon it seemed that almost every day another transport put in. There was the rattle of drums with the shouts of officers, and off the ships poured a flood, scarlet as a tide of blood. Boston was inundated with British soldiers, and now every third person one met in the street wore the handsome uniform of King George III. There wasn't much work to do. Rab by himself could set the entire newspaper in a day. The subscriptions had dropped partly because many people could not afford a paper, and partly because so many Whig families were leaving Boston for the country. Johnny could deliver the Boston papers in a morning instead of taking all day. June was ending, and the boys stood about the common, watching the soldiers of the 1st Brigade camped there under Earl Percy. Row upon row of identical tents, cook fires, tethered horses of officers, camp followers, stacked muskets, the quick, smart pacing of sentries, all was neat and orderly. And I have to tell you, doing like an ancestry thing, I'm related to the Percys. I don't know if it's this one, but I have some Percys in my family. It's super weird to look back and go, whoops, okay, came somewhere from England. At least one of my grandparents did. Anyway, muskets. It was the muskets which interested Rab the most. Already on every village green throughout New England, men and boys were drilling in defiance of the king's orders. They said they were afraid of an attack from the French. These men had no uniforms. They came from the fields and farms in the very clothes they used for plowing. That was all right, but the weapons they brought to their drilling were not. Many had ancient flintlocks, old squirrel guns handed down for generations. Think about the gun that was used in The Sign of the Beaver when he talks about his old matchlock with the not great aim. Rab, for instance, and that story takes place like 100 years, no, maybe 50 years before this. Rab, for instance, all that spring had been going to Lexington once or twice to drill with his fellow townsmen. But he could not beg nor buy a decent gun. He drilled with an old fowling piece his grandsire had given him to shoot ducks on the Concord River. Never had Johnny seen Rab so bothered about anything as he was over his inability to get himself a good modern gun. I don't mind their shooting at me, he would say to Johnny, and I don't mind shooting at them, but God give me a gun in my hands that can do better than knock over a rabbit at 10 feet. The British soldiers went about their business as though oblivious of the many hostile, curious eyes watching them. The British are ignoring the townspeople. They were confident that these provincials, that means people from the local province, these yokels, like farm people, hicks from the country, the sticks, now gaping at their equipment, gauging the manner of fighting men they were, would be so impressed they would never stand up and fight them. Rab, so concerned over a gun as he was, did an uncharacteristic, foolish thing. The two boys were standing close to a stack of muskets. As Rab explained to Johnny their good points, he put out a hand and touched the lock on one. Without even showing bad temper, almost impartially, a mounted officer sitting his horse close by, chatting with a couple of Boston's Tory girls, swung about and struck Rab a heavy blow on the side of his head with the flat of his sword. Smack! Then he went on flirting with the girls as though nothing had happened. Rab never knew what hit him. Now a sergeant came bawling, "Spectators are not to intrude. Get back behind them ropes. Get back, all of you. Get back." Johnny stayed where he was, beside the unconscious Rab. Now that's kind of what you call a sucker punch. To hit someone in the side of the head, that's a very tender spot there on your temple. It can be deadly. Rab, yet, after this act of sudden violence, Johnny stayed where he was beside the unconscious Rab. Yet, after this act of sudden violence, the boys were well treated. Johnny was not run through, that means stabbed to death, because he stayed with his friend, did not obey the sergeant. A gray, older man, a medical officer, approached, called for water, sponged Rab's face for him, and said he was coming too. Johnny was not to worry. So it's like the mounted officer on the horse smacks him, knocks him out, and then immediately, doot, 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 here comes first aid, like the paramedics. What was he doing? Just looking at a gun. Touching it? Well, yes. And only got hit over the head? He got off easy. Filching a soldier's arms is a serious misdemeanor. Wonder Lieutenant Bragg didn't kill him. Rab said thickly, I hadn't thought to filch it. Not bad idea. Guess I'll... He was still groggy from the blow. If ever I get a chance, I'll... The medical man only laughed at him. Now, boys, he said seriously, you forget talk like that. I should talk with a British accent. No, that would probably bother me. You remember that we don't like being here in Boston any better than you like having us. I'd rather be with my wife and children in Bath. And that's a town, not actually like a tub. Look at the capital. That's a clue there. Okay, the town of Bath. We're both in a tight spot, but if we keep our tempers and you keep your tempers, why, we can fix up things between us somehow. We're all one people, you know. That's the British view, and these are the soldiers. As he talked, Johnny had an experience he was to have many more times. The troops would do something he considered unforgivable, like nearly braining Rab for merely touching a gun, and then the next moment be so civil and friendly he could not help but like them, at least some of them, as individuals. The medical man, oops, there go the lights, hold on. The medical man, noticing Johnny's riding boots and spurs, was saying, I've a cousin lives over in Cambridge. Haven't had a chance to send him a letter. Do either of you know a boy with a good horse who'd ride for me? Does anyone know of a good boy with a good horse? Rab was mouthing, yes, at Johnny. I've got a good horse. Come to me at 1 o'clock. Sorry, that's so odd. Come to me at 1 o'clock sharp this noon. I'm quartered on Mr. Shaw, North Square. On the way home, Rab said, if you can get started carrying messages for him, others may follow. Might be we could learn things Sam Adams and Dr. Warren and Paul Revere would like to know. They wouldn't dare send their own orderlies, fearful somebody might kill them. I'd thought of that myself. But at 1 o'clock, as he stood beside Goblin in North Square receiving money and the letter from the medical captain, also a pleasant smile, one thing upset him. Paul Revere's house was almost next door. There was a girl there about his age. She was standing before her house, almost bent horizontal at the hips. She was sticking out at him the longest, reddest tongue he had ever seen. Why do you think she's doing that? Because he's a British. He looks like he's working for the British. And as he mounted and swung about to leave the British officer, he heard her shrilling in a horrible sing-song, He loves the British, he loves the British. But that night, on his return, when he went to tell Mr. Revere, there was no question but that Mr. Shirtleaf of Cambridge, always considered a lukewarm Whig, was in reality a leader of the Tories in Middlesex County. He saw little Miss Revere again. Father says, she apologized handsomely, that I'm not to believe everything I see. And, believe anything you like. Johnny was feeling good. He had charged the medical man 3 times the price he would have dared charged a Yankee. And by what Mr. Shirtleaf had said to his wife on reading this letter, he had found out something worth, not much, but at least worth knowing. I like to see you stick out your tongue, he went on. It is so long and red, I thought at first it was a hound dog dressed up in pink petticoats. I never guessed it was a young lady. So there's Johnny, the insulting Johnny, finishing end of section 1. So click subscribe and find out what happens next on the next video.